Greetings to everyone. I pray that everybody's doing okay and doing well. It is truly a privilege to be here with all of you guys. This week in our Kumi Now session, we'll be discussing Indigenous rights, but we'll be having more of a conversation about decoloniality, indigeneity, and intersectionality. And we are here with a very special guest, an expert on this issue within theology, and it's Shadia Kupti. I'll introduce Shadia Kupti very, very quickly, and then we can begin our conversation. Sorry, I forgot that just some housekeeping that please remain muted throughout the conversation. And if you have any questions, please put them on the chat, and I'll ask them towards Shadia at the end in the Q&A session. Moreover, this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to Facebook and our YouTube channels. So if you wish to remain anonymous or to put your camera off, please do so now. And now we can begin. So Shadia Kupti is a Palestinian theologian and practitioner who has worked in peace building and advocacy initiatives for 15 years through local and international organizations in Israel and Palestine. As a Palestinian Christian, she is particularly focused on amplifying the voices and perspectives of women and other minorities in various ways, one of which is the Woman Behind the Wall podcast. I'll be asking more about that later. Shadia was born and raised in Nazareth. She studied international relations and English language at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, then conflict resolution and nonviolent action at Trinity Dublin College in Ireland. Recently, she has completed another master's in interreligious and indigenous studies at Vancouver School of Theology in Vancouver. Shadia currently lives and works for a local United Church of Canada in Vancouver as the community engagement animator. Shadia, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Sam. And hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Looking forward to our conversation together.
So before we begin our conversation, could you tell a bit more about yourself? Where did you grow up? What is this podcast that you founded?
Yeah, so I grew up in Nazareth. As many of you know, Nazareth is the largest Palestinian community inside the Green Line or Israel. And believe it or not, my parents are Baptists, so I grew up quite in the Baptist community, very active in different church and parachurch activities. Then I moved to Jerusalem. I studied there, and I also worked for a local faith-based organization promoting reconciliation. And then I moved on to work for World Vision for a bit. And throughout my career path, it's always been kind of working with peace building in the where you're trying to amalgamate faith or faith and practice in a context that's quite intractable. But learning it's something that's that I learned through engaging with other contexts. As you see from my background, I got a chance to be in Ireland and study there, actually, with the help of Sabeel. And then now here I am in Vancouver and learning as I go every day more and more about the Indigenous context here as well. And one of the projects that I co-produced with two of my friends was to, as we've been working in peace building, especially in the church communities, we noticed that many times women's voices is usually represented, but not necessarily giving a similar platform to other Palestinian colleagues who are male. So the podcast idea is to provide an entry point where we have Christian Palestinian women share about their experiences. And in this way, they intersect their gender and their faith and in the conflict, and trying to capture different women in different age groups, different stages of life, and how they navigate really living under occupation on the other side of the wall, which is why we call the podcast Women Behind the Wall. The website is there to kind of complement a lot of the context right through the micro. You kind of get an introduction into the macro, and just kind of giving you at least threads to start and unpack some of these issues. Here we are. So now, kind of delving into the Indigenous context here in Canada. Which I'm grateful for the opportunity, and really it's been a very high learning curve for me.
Thank you. It seems to me that in the last few years, there's been a rise in trying, particularly in the academic side of things, to incorporate Indigenous voices. And this is partially a paradigm shift in discussing about colonialism and decoloniality. I know that you studied Indigenous theology in Vancouver, and you kind of discussed the different lessons Palestinian theology can learn from Indigenous theology. What are the similarities between the context of the Indigenous people in Canada and the Indigenous people in Palestine? What common denominator do they have?
I mean, just choosing the topic to study, I met in a different context. I met an Indigenous theologian who just the way he spoke, the way he incorporated his Indigenous spirituality into his prayer, in a way that intrigued me very, very much so. And so that really led me to kind of dip in my hands into kind of a master's. I don't want to commit too much, so let's do a master's and see what's there. And really the sense was, as a Palestinian, there was a lot of even in classes and interaction with the context, though the contexts are completely different, very unique in their own way, but there is this commonality, a common understanding of what it means to live and experience being othered in a settler colonial context. And I think, it brings a question to what is indigeneity, how it's expressed also in theology as well. And a lot of the learnings is, you hear about another context and you reflect it on your own. And I think in many ways, for example, one of the commonalities is, especially looking at the field of theology between North American Indigenous and Palestinians, right? This is where we experience Christianity having this double-sided sword, that in some ways it's used against us as a peoples and to justify land theft and land grab. But on the other hand, there are representatives from the community who are also Christian. So how do you navigate that aspect of being a member of the same faith that has also been weaponized against you? And I think there's a lot there that, although the approach is different, the decolonization process is different. There is still an area that needs to be further explored, I would say. And I'm no means an expert, many times as a Palestinian, when we have allies or friends come over, they're like, there's so much to learn. It's so confusing. I'm put in this place where it's also, I can say the same, like it's very complex, the context here, and it differs from Canada to the United States to provinces, the language, the historical familiarity. It is still a learning process. And also, how do you work in a context which is very different than our context, where the church is and the public opinion wants to decolonize or wants to face the aspects of history that have perpetrated injustice and genocide to its indigenous peoples. And I must say, it's a very different experience where I come from, where as Palestinians, we're still fighting to be acknowledged. We're still fighting to be seen as equals too. Yeah, I'll stop here, but maybe we can talk more about that as well.
Yeah. No, it's definitely true. When you're under oppression, you have a double task. You have the task of surviving colonialism and oppression, and you have the task of explaining your humanity and explaining your suffering. And as we're marking Indigenous Day for all Indigenous peoples, within Canada, South Africa, Australia, Palestine, there's a common denominator, which is dispossessing indigenous people from their land. And as the late great scholar Patrick Wolf said, settler colonialism has a logic of elimination, and part of that elimination manifests in disrupting the relationship between indigenous people and their land. I'm wondering, Palestinian liberation theology, ever since its emergence, has discussed the importance of the land. And it's remained a central theme within Palestinian theology in general, not only liberation. What lessons have you learned studying indigenous theology that you can apply to Palestinian theology?
Yeah. It's a beautiful question, and it's one that I'm still thinking about. When you sit down and you write a thesis and you're trying to formulate what you've learned and what you have you're exploring and analyzing. But I think I'm still thinking and processing all the information. But I would say that looking at the North American Indigenous theological expressions of relationship to land, I think it also, you're always reflecting on your own, as Palestinian theologians, how do they decolonize and how do they express their relationship to land. Both in my thesis, in the end, I assessed where the literature review is between how do Palestinians and North American Indigenous, what conversations are existing, so that I can see how you can take it further. And actually, one of the first conversations, if you want to call them, or more so like paralleling the issues of understandings of land, is between Naim Ati and Robert Allen Warrior, where they both critique liberation theology's reading of the Exodus story. And interestingly enough, Robert Allen Warrior, he is known as an Indigenous scholar. He was very much influenced by Edward Said, who's known as the forefather of post-colonialism or decolonialism, especially in Indigenous sovereignty. But both Warrior and Assis published their works looking at how liberation theology, if they're identifying with the Israelites in the Exodus story, right, then God is the deliverer, but at the same time, he is the conqueror, right, of the Canaanites. And really starting to kind of bring it into that complexity of how do we read the Bible and how do we read Old Testament specifically, justifying taking land from the indigenous peoples there. And you're really hitting a lot of complex issues, because that's where if you are othered as a Canaanite and you're othered as not the chosen people, then how do you come to terms to that? The way Indigenous or North American Indigenous theologians express their relationship to land is very different than how Palestinian theologians in the academia have expressed their relationship to land. And I think part of colonization is also very, very much embedded in academic sites, especially I think from what I've seen in theology. in very much so, the first and second wave of Palestinian theologians have done a lot of work, and I've been influenced by that in my theological formulation. But we've been really, in many ways, defining, or my opinion is, we are defining who we are by saying what we are not. Right, we are not Christian Zionists. Whether this scholar or that scholar, the way they write about land is disconnected from the social political context. And as Palestinians who live in a context, we stand still and say that's not correct, or we challenge these different understandings of conquest, or who are the chosen people. What does it mean where is the promised land? Whereas in North American Indigenous theologians, their methodology even, is distancing itself from engaging in these existing conversations, because they're still very colonial, and really looking more so inward as to what is Indigenous ways of knowing, what is Indigenous ways of being. And it's so much so, in both contexts, they say land is life. So how can you put it in these categorizations and make it into a systematic form when it's everything about who you are as Indigenous peoples? And it was just fascinating to me to see how they both have the same outlook on land, but the way they're expressing it is very, very different. And there's so much to learn there, I think. And as a Palestinian Christian, I don't know if I'm the third wave or fourth one at this point in theological formulation, but I'm at the point where I'm asking myself, if we are taking a stance against Christian Zionism, the big question is, what is then a Palestinian theology of land? What can I say about my theology of land aside from what it is not? And that's really kind of one of the reasons I am looking at another context. And I think North American Indigenous peoples and theologians have maybe more experience in being colonized, let's say, for more than 500 years. And there's something there to learn from these elders and from their experience. Not to say that we have the same experience, but at least there's it's an entry point to kind of explore these questions together, about what it means to decolonize a very colonial academic site.
Yeah, it's so interesting to point out how Palestinian and Indigenous theology doesn't really, problematizes using Exodus as a narrative for their theology, whilst Latin American liberation theology and Black liberation theology, that is a central focus.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when you read Black liberation theology, particularly James Cone, who's the father of Black liberation theology, you see that a lot of the critiques he got from his colleagues and students is that he's basing his Black liberation theology as a reaction to white supremacy, rather than celebrating, the rich culture and traditions, epistemologies that Black people had in North America. And I think, you enter into a very difficult conversation, because on one hand, there's a reaction to colonialism, but as, Frantz Fanon and other scholars and decolonial scholars can show, you're reacting to you're using the tools of the oppressor, rather than trying to dismantle the whole house and cultivating a theology that is expressing your indigeneity, expressing your identity. You're basing it off a reactionary kind of response. And I find that very, very interesting. And I think in the process of dispossessing Indigenous people from their land, you need to dispossess their whole humanity in general, whether it's their culture, it's their diversity, their identity, their traditions, epistemologies. It doesn't stop only by the elimination of the body, but it's the elimination of the mind. In what ways would you indigenize or decolonize a Palestinian theology or theology in general?
Yeah.
How would you make the steps towards that? Because it seems to me it's not just a process of learning, but it's a process of unlearning and learning at the same time.
Yeah. And I think I want to also maybe point out here, which is a very decolonial approach, is really I'm looking at the location of myself as the author or the knowledge producer, right? It really differs from where each person is and what their experience has been. Now, mind you, I've grown up Baptist, right? And that really has a lot of impact of how do you then deconstruct a lot of these theologies and cultures that you have been exposed to, or in some ways or the other given access to, and where things are at. And I'm saying that because knowledge production really of who gets to produce, to say this is interpretation or this is not interpretation, what does God say about this or God say about that? It's been a process to really ask these questions, especially the line between in what ways does culture and the location of the interpreter play into account into how to interpret the text. And again, I think in the Canadian context, the saying or the understanding was about residential school is the whole attempt to kill the Indian and save the child, right? So there was this deliberate a role that the church played in trying to make the indigenous like them, right? If they, can't speak your language, and this has really been a cultural genocide that was implemented here for many, many years. Now, how does that look like? How, I'm not saying in the same way as Palestinian Christians, but I feel like as a Baptist, there were also many ways in my worship and liturgy that have disconnected me or distanced me from my ancestral background, even as a Christian, right? I mean, a lot of the Palestinian Christians who became Protestant were from Eastern denominations, right? My family name is Coptic, so I don't know what does it mean to be a Coptic. I don't know much about liturgy because I grew up in the Baptist denomination. And one of the things that encountering or engaging with North American Indigenous content is asking that question is, in what ways have I been disconnected from my own heritage, ancestral knowledge production? And is there a way to reclaim it? Is there a way to have that deconstruction happen? And so, in my family context, my mom grew up because of the Nakba, she grew up in a Southern Baptist home where many children, her and other children were brought up by these missionaries, and there's a lot of nuances of how they were looked at and differently or lower than because they were Arab. Right. And so how do you come to terms with that? How do you keep the faith in some ways, but also acknowledge that there was also some colonization coming from fellow Christians, Western Christians, who thought they were better just because we were not like them. And so I think it starts by asking the question, where is the role of our culture as Palestinian Christians? We all have different backgrounds, different culture, spiritual heritage, and how does that come into play in our faith today? And part of that is maybe in writing theology, expressing yourself, but I think it's going to culture, looking at our unique expressions and relationships to land and relationships to God that are embedded in our culture, and not only this binary that God is in the church or God is in one place, but not outside of it. Yes, we have liturgy in Arabic, but beyond the language, what else are we amalgamating? What else are we bringing into our spirituality? Or is our liturgy pretty much the same everywhere, or is it unique to the location, to the land we are in? And so I would say one of the ways to move towards that is, I think, looking at our culture. I think, looking at our ways of being and our ways of knowing, and bringing that into our theology and not keeping it kind of away from it. And in some ways, though I am relying on the work of other Palestinian theologians who have already done the work on really formulating a stance of who we are not. And I hope to be able to at least contribute a little bit in terms of maybe looking at, for example, embroidery as a spiritual relationship to land. Can we say that? And how does that come into play? Right? Embroidery is the matriarchal storytelling that's passed on through generations. But a lot of it is acknowledging your environment, acknowledging what is around you, in terms of nature, in terms of creation, and saying, this is my sacred relationship to this environment. And there's a lot of spirituality there that I think we need to bring it to a site that's always 20 years, late, or 20 years behind, and say, this is also a form of spiritual relationship to land, and we should embrace it, and not only speak to what is being said about us, or maybe not said about us, but also here's who we are, here's our ways of being, and that's the relationship with our relationship to land.
I have maybe a comment before I ask, because it's, once you enter into these conversations, you switch lens.
Mm-hmm.
You mention embroidery, you can mention food, you can mention different dances that Palestinians do, weddings, all of these cultural phenomenons that are deeply spiritual. And and it reminds me of what Rafiq Khoury writes about the incarnation in Palestinian culture,
Mm-hmm.
and kind
Mm-hmm.
of building more Palestinian theology on that. But I'd like to go back to the kind of first point you spoke about, is your positionality.
Mm-hmm.
And one way colonialism is manifested is that it normalizes a position, which is usually white, middle-class, male, Western. And that becomes the norm of doing theology, rather than putting your positionality out there, and that is the lens of how you do theology.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
And we understand that colonialism is a web of things. You mentioned embroidery. One of the thefts of Palestinian culture is also commercializing culture, is making different cultural aspects of Palestine into a product.
Yeah.
So then you get into a discussion of capitalism, and who is it taking the jobs of? Palestinian women. So you enter into a conversation of gender. Within your positionality as a Palestinian Christian woman, can you speak more about the importance of intersectionality when we talk about fighting for Palestine, when we try and do Palestinian theology? Can you talk a bit more about the intersectional approach that we need?
Oh, absolutely. Again, just to show you how much I am tailored by my theological upbringing. So when I approached my thesis, trying to converse these two contexts on understandings of land, the first place I went to look for, I said, for sure, there are existing conversations in theology of land, right? Not school, because, right, it's all about relationship to land. So I was kind of anticipating there would be a lot more conversations between Palestinians and North American Indigenous, but lo and behold, there wasn't. Again, Robert Allen Warrior and Assis, they were parallel together, but they never, at least as far as I could research, they were never interacted with each other. They're talked about each other, but not with each other. But the majority of the scholarship in that school of theology of land is predominantly white, male initially, right? And then you have the first wave of Palestinian Christians who are challenging that and started to kind of raise their voices and elevate the Palestinian plight. So they're also men, and most of them were clergy, and they used that their position to elevate the voices. And so and interestingly enough, in the at least from my research in North American Indigenous context, there was only one female theologian, or I'm not sure if she identifies as a theologian, who was interacting with the Israeli-Palestinian context. And mind you, only one Asian scholar, but I couldn't find any female white Western scholar. And so there's that question of, to what degree is even the School of Theology of Land is very much still patriarchal, is still very selective in terms of who gets to speak and who gets to write. But so as a Palestinian woman, you're constantly looking for voices that can elevate represent where you're coming from, who you are. But this hasn't, I'm always questioning, like, or asking myself, where are the Palestinian Christian women? Because we definitely have a lot to say, but we are not engaged in these academic sites. And the question, I'm motivated to bring it more into the hope that I can contribute to that. But it raises the question of, calling for equality or bringing a gender representation. The root problem, or maybe I would always think like maybe it's Middle Eastern patriarchy, it's something to do with the context, but it's also apparent in Western academic sites. I wouldn't need, I don't want to say also in the church, because it differs on denominations. But that raises the question of representation and to what degree that is influenced by the system. And another thing about commodification, Sam, which you have mentioned, right? Everything is commodified. It becomes, even land, right? In many ways, land is commodified. It becomes a resource everyone covets, regardless of who's living there or not. And in some ways, I think I've come across one attempt to say, your relationship to land, or how you understand land, in some ways is connected to how you relate to women, because in many ways women are also commodified. We've become in many ways women are the victims of violence. And it seems to, if you say women and children died as a result of Israeli military incursion, that seemingly tries to play on a more sympathy, as opposed to say only men died, right? And why is that so? Why are also women, even in conflict, have been commodified in the sense that we're used as a commodity to raise a sympathy over a situation? And it makes you think that it seems like there's also capitalism puts gendered people or people of minorities into certain roles that you've become set to put in, and very few kind of break that, or are able to break that ceiling that is set there. It's a big question. And I know that in Sabil, women have been more active, are very much part of the leadership, like Sider and Samia, like they're writing, and there's quite a lot there. But again, it's where I come from, and my community, my denominational community, it's a much more conservative, let's say, and women are still have a lot of work to do to kind of break those ceilings.
Definitely. A lot of people would say what you're saying is not academic. A lot of people would say, this is not how you write theological papers. This is not how, this is actually a political bias opinion. A lot of people would say, sure, you can have a biased opinion in academia, but you need to be careful how much you involve politics. You need to, is it more an activist voice? Is it more of an academic voice? Again, you have a binary. You constantly, whenever you have whenever you navigate and trying to deconstruct many things, you understand that there's all the time binaries. And one of them is activism and academia. So how do you navigate you being an activist, whether I should even call that, even that term is problematic, and an academic?
Yeah, and it's definitely so. I mean, that binary is also relevant in the research. If you look at the settler colonial paradigm, it's very much informed by activism, especially the co-solidarity transnational movement between Palestinian and North American struggle against settler colonialism. And again, this is again the question of neutrality, if you want to call it, right? Is the person here, especially when it comes to maybe exegetical work and interpretation, is there such a thing as a neutral? And I think Edward Said was very much, he developed post-colonialism and trying to be very scientific in the sense that trying to, building a system where you use the master's tools to dismantle the house or the master's house, right? And so I think this binary between what is political and what is maybe theological or academic and activist, there's always this non-synchronized dance between them. And part of really decolonization is to say you cannot separate context from theory. You cannot separate practice from theory, and I think in many ways this is what Palestinians and North American Indigenous have said all along, because colonization is also it's a domination of one culture over others. And so in some ways, who gets to decide which culture is more neutral than other is more subjective. And even my learning process about the North American Indigenous context, there's the co-solidarity movement has been ongoing since the 70s. But as a Palestinian, I've never heard of it. I didn't come across it. And the question comes as to why are these co-solidarity movements not more visible or not more known? And I think it also comes to reflect my own background. Is maybe as an evangelical, we kind of tend to keep things again separated. The spiritual and the material, they're kind of two different ends and they don't come together. But that's not the only worldview or approach to have. And mind you, in Indigenous methodologies, which is also its own ways to decolonize research methodologies, it's all about being accessible. It's all about being accountable and responsible to your own culture, to your own knowledge production, and not necessarily to engage and to counter what is already out there. And so one of the reasons that North American Indigenous theologians are not necessarily in the School of Theology of Land is that they are not interested to engage with existing conversations, because they want to say things in their own way. They want to express their own relationship to land as their obligation to their own ancestral ways of being, in a sense. And as Palestinians, I think our life is this amalgamation between being activists, but also being academic. And we use academia as a tool to invite people, to invite readers, invite other academics to join us in our activism. And it's hard to separate activism from academia in a Palestinian context.
It reminds me of I think it was one of the Buff brothers from Brazil who described liberation theology as a plant. You have the laity or the roots, you have the church and the clergy as the stalk of the plant, and then the flowers are the academic. I'm not sure how accurate that is, and what runs through them is the sap, which is the common denominator. I'm not sure how that could be analyzed again and discussed, but the thing I take from it is there's a common denominator between all of those actions. And when we speak about liberation theology, Palestinian liberation theology, we need to be careful. What are, are we speaking about the activists? Are we speaking about the academics? If it is the academics, it connects to activism. If it's the, the people, the laity, they are also producers of knowledge, and just in a very different way.
Mhm.
So I definitely connect to that. I mean, we can speak here all day long about.
Yeah, I just want to say that another example that you reminded me of earlier is about weddings. And in my church, I did a reflection, looking. I'll explain my methodology, but I try to look at Palestinian custom of the Shlait Larus, where it's a custom that women, it's called the dancing with, and they dance right in their wedding one of the wedding parties. She holds two candles and she sways, and it's because when you say it in Arabic, Tijlait Larus and Tajalli, which is the transfiguration, they come from the same root, these words. And so I was trying to play with these two and say, how do they converse with one another? Again, taking that step of looking at traditions, cultural traditions, and trying to bring it in the forefront in conversation with interpretation or in theology and in worship. And the methodology I used is the same one I used for my thesis, because this is also the challenge of using comparison comparing as a methodology. It's because when you're comparing, you're trying to find common ground, and it doesn't do justice to neither context if you're saying we're the same. And so I was trying to find a methodology that kind of doesn't go into that zone, and I used one of Edward Said's methodology called contrapuntal method. And it's taken from the music theory, where you play two tunes together and you try to see how do they correlate with one another. And so in the sense, I'm not trying to compare Palestinian and North American Indigenous understandings of land, but I'm trying to see if they were to talk to each other, what can they say to each other? And so I did the same methodology looking at the transfiguration of Jesus with the transfiguration of the bride custom in Palestinian cultures. And mind you, it's not only Christians do it, it's a Palestinian tradition, but you can take it and say, what does it tell me about relationship to God?
Right. Yeah. Amazing. I apologize in advance if I don't pick up on all of the questions, but we have a few questions, Shadia. Perhaps I'll say all of them and then you can respond to them one by one. So the first question is, many people talk about progress, that women's rights, there's been progress in there, there's that talk of progress. Would you say there has been some progress or rights that have been achieved for women in Palestine? Another question is, and this is also connected, I think, to the idea of doing indigenous theology, is that in many ways, colonialism has erased indigenous traditions, epistemologies, and identities. Is there a way of countering that? Is it possible to counter that kind of erasure, I guess? I'm not sure if that's grammatically correct, but I hope you understand what I mean. You studied in Dublin. That's also a colonial context with the British, which is no surprise. What have you learned about the colonization of the Irish and how they survived? And there may be aspects of Sumud. And then there's another question that asks about, when we train clergy in the church, how can we shift the kind of the narrative that working for justice is actually a spiritual mandate, not only a political stance? that involving politics is part of living out your faith rather than having just a political stance to a subject. So yeah.
Okay. Well, about the first question about progress, if there's been some progress for women in Palestine, it's a very big question to say, but if I were to apply a decolonial lens, I would say, what is progress and who gets to decide, which direction, or is it linear? And so in what way I would ask, like, can we unpack this? What does progress mean? Because women, Palestinian women undergo multi-layered forms of oppression or discrimination. And so can progress be on one end while all other injustices continue, right? And it's a big question to unpack here, because if, it's like when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, all of a sudden in the news, it's like, oh, the schools, women are no longer permitted to school. Well, is that the only indicator of success, is if women go to school in Afghanistan? What about other forms of injustice? And to what degree is this news, who is it serving? Why are we focusing on only that element and not opposed to the system? So I think there in some ways there have been if you want to call it progress for women, but in the sense it's also women's, it's the place of women to say what is progress to them and how they want to take it on. But there are multi-layers of, it's a multi-layered question, and maybe we can unpack it at another chance. And in some ways, yeah, let's leave it at that. But I love the question. We can talk more about it offline as well. About indigenous theological and indigenous erased traditions. Yes. Well, the short answer would be, right, that colonization has caused cultural erasure, and is there a way to counter that? Well, again, if I just do a very simple observation on the North American indigenous context, you have 500 years of colonization, but still many indigenous nations still have their culture and their tradition is even actually in acceleration. A lot of languages are being revived or preserved in one way or another. So there are ways to counter cultural erasure, but it has to be intentional and it has to be ongoing, because even in Palestinian context, our knowledge is mainly transferred through orally, right? Ancestral knowledge and all of that. So that's still ongoing, regardless of whether academia has caught up to it or not. So there are ways to preserve your own culture and your own tradition and your own identity, despite efforts to try to erase that or to hide it or in some ways. But I think, one resource is books and academia, but another is to engage with people and hear their stories. I mean, story is a container of knowledge, especially in oral traditions. And so that's really been a way for Palestinians and indigenous peoples to preserve their way of being and their identities. Well, in terms of Dublin, yes, it feels like so far away, right? My Irish experience. So I was in Dublin, and I was encountering a lot of the students were also from like Ireland, not necessarily Northern Ireland. So that perspective is maybe different than if I were to study in Northern Ireland. But what I've learned there, in the sense is that if politically the conflict is resolved, it doesn't necessarily mean the conflict has been resolved. In many instances, in some ways, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, there's political peacemaking, but then how long does it take for it actually to restore justice to the peoples? And just from and my observation in the Irish context, that there are still issues happening in Northern Ireland that the public or political peace hasn't yet achieved. And especially, when I went to when we went on a visit to Belfast, and you see kind of this allies with the Palestinian Israeli context as well. There is something to it that, for me, it's more about, again, this idea that in many ways we're not the only conflict that has experienced settler colonialism. It's happened everywhere, and in many places it's just our knowledge or our exposure to it has yet to be explored. And that's kind of what I can think. I think it's different. I'm just at a different place to bring back a lot of these learnings. How to train clergy, shift the narrative towards justice. I mean, I think it depends. I think part of it goes back to interpretation, right? And how do we look at the Bible? Because is it all about, the Bible talks a lot about justice, and what does that mean? To be whole, right? To be in peace with not only with other peoples, but also with the community of creation around us. And in many ways, the church is much more and I find a lot of churches are much more willing to go for ecological justice, for example. Let's look for, because it's maybe now more immediate, the ecological crisis we're facing, in what ways, at least maybe I'm influenced by Vancouver, but I'm assuming it's everywhere, looking at restoring justice for ecology. But I think we do a lot of selective reading, and we choose our justice issues that we want to read and apply in our church. And so I would say, I mean, in my current work with the United Church of Canada, I was surprised how much social justice oriented it is. You cannot separate the both. You cannot separate justice from spirituality or Sunday worship. And it's definitely a process that people go through, and we just need to keep pushing that needle to bring the issues, which is in some ways. Let me give you an example. In a lot, I went to a seminary here, right? And so a lot of the in order to become a clergy, right, you have to take these foundational courses, and your selectives then become, maybe let's look at global issues, let's look at these more social justice oriented issues, because the understanding is, to be clergy, you have to know Old Testament, you have to know Hebrew, Greek, right? There's all these tools that you need to have. But then in your electives, you can choose maybe other issues. And it's the way we look at these binaries in our learning or in our approach to academia or science, right? We always think it's up there, it's neutral, it's all about the tools, and then we apply it onto context. And I think the shift starts also there, is that even in seminary, that's where we need to challenge, is that to be clergy, you also need to be aware of social justice. And I think, if you want to do some policy and advocacy, I think starts in not with the clergy, but with who's training the clergy, and insisting that social justice is part of the mandatory courses that you have to take to become a clergy in any denominations you're at.
And I'd just like to add that, just on what you said, that a good clergy, a good pastor needs to smell like sheep. If the clergy and the pastors are in with the community, are amongst them, dealing with their problems, they will have to deal with their reality, which is inevitably political. They need to smell like them even.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's super important what you said.
Yeah.
Can
I add? I think if I can add just something, coming to the existing conversations that I found vary, right? There's two accounts, and they're really less than two hands, right? Like that's where the conversations or existing conversations are at between these two contexts. And a lot of them have to do with, with interaction, right? How the transnational solidarity there has to be an interaction between both contexts. And it's fascinating to see that in two accounts, the two both are Canadian. They are both identify as white settler descent Canadians. Their realization that's of the settler colonialism of their context only came to be, was realized when they went to Israel, Palestine, right? And it was in their trip. One of them is a Mennonite, and he went on a I think it was called Christian Peacemaking Team. I think today they've changed the name, if I'm not mistaken, right? Is it Community Peacemaking Team? So with CPT, and in one of his, he was in the hills of Ramallah, and he encountered soldiers. And that conversation with these soldiers, he applied it. He realized as a Canadian, he's also he needs to go back and check his positionality as a settler colonial in Canadian context. And another example was also with another person who went on a church trip, and speaking to, I think, an Israeli activist, he realized, he did the trip, they met Palestinian Christians, they heard their plight, and very moved by seeing the checkpoint, the occupation, the apartheid wall. And then, when he finished, he said, "What can we as Canadians do to help you?" And the activist responded and said, "Go work on your own settler colonial context. Go do your own work as well," right? And then he clicks to him that, oh, right. And I think in many ways, I'm not saying, we should be exclusive to one or the other. And in the same way I did, I'm traveling to Canada as a Palestinian to learn about the Indigenous context here. But it's important to realize that we need to keep relationships, and we need to constantly promote this transnational or geographical proximity. At the same time, so there's also this big question of the dual positionality of Palestinians who are residing and living in North America. A lot of us, how a lot of Palestinians see the US or Canada as these great places to live, and it is a great place to live in some ways. And that's where, for many, Israel is a great place to live, right? It's a sanctuary, it's a democracy. But we need to realize that there's also settler colonialism happening here. And as I'm speaking to, I am currently residing on an unceded traditional ancestral land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So how do you navigate that dual positionality, that you might have been displaced from Israeli settler colonialism, but you are also working and living and studying on stolen lands that belong to Indigenous peoples? And it's a very sensitive to talk about this in a sense, because I think it gives you that new lens you were mentioning, Sam. It gives you a different lens to look at things. And so what does solidarity look like between Palestinians, who live in North America, with Palestinian Israel Palestine, but also with the Indigenous context here? And keeping in mind, as yes, there are advantages and better quality of life in North America, but there's also still ongoing injustice and land theft happening to its Indigenous peoples. And how do we acknowledge that and work towards a co-solidarity that really reflects how we want to be treated, right?
Yeah, how we truly liberate if other people around the world suffering the same systems are not liberated as well. In an effort to show solidarity to you as the Kumi now community and the people here, friends of Palestine, friends of Sabeel, maybe not. how can we support your individual work, and what can we do to help also within the Canadian context, whether it's Palestine or the Indigenous community?
Yeah. Um, I think on a personal level, I finished my thesis and I'm hoping to continue for a PhD. I'm in the process of hoping to apply for a program. But, if you have any ideas about publications, I'm happy to work with you on that. I think it's, as a Palestinian theologian, I have not come across any other Palestinian theologian residing in North America that has written about written about or talked with the North American Indigenous context. So there's an area here. I think that's a good entry point to talk about the Palestinian situation, in the sense that I think the Canadian public is much more in tune and aware and working towards decolonization to its own history and present relationship to Indigenous peoples. And in many ways, if both systems have used similar processes, similar systems, then there shouldn't be, if you're already on board in terms of decolonizing settler colonialism in Canada, you can also do the same towards joining in Palestinians in decolonizing settler colonialism in Israel. And in some ways, this can maybe give people another entry point of an aha moment that can bring our advocacy work together as well. And look out United Church of Canada. We have a network. If you're a member of the United Church of Canada, Onjepi has a network, and we would love to hear from you and work more towards things. We're constantly doing sessions and work together to maintain the relationship with the Palestinians, especially with Sabeel, and how do we work together to bring advocacy work and hopefully get to see some peace. Thank you. Mariana just put the link for Onjepi's website. But even if you're not United Church of Canada, you're welcome to reach out. I don't know, I can put my email here, and let's continue this conversation.
Thank you very much, Shadia, for all your wisdom. And speaking about wisdom, you also had your wisdom teeth taken out not long ago. Was it yesterday or 2 days ago?
3 days ago on Thursday. So I don't know if you can tell, but I'm a little bloated on the cheek ends. So
we wish you a very swift recovery, and thank you again for your coming along and sharing with you some of the lessons you've learned and your insights. I know that I've definitely gained a lot from it, and I'm sure others as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And again, it's a beginning of a conversation, and happy to continue on.
Yeah, for sure. For next week, Kumi Now session, it will be a book launch on a new book that's coming out. Kathleen Christensen, I think, is the author of it. So make sure to stay tuned to next week. We'll be discussing her book, a bit about how the US has been involved in Palestine. So thank you again for attending, for asking very good questions. There'll be information in the newsletter. Stay tuned on Facebook and on other social media platforms for our next Kumi call. And I think by this we will end our session. Thank you very much, everyone.